we're doing Hilchos Tzitzis right now, and we are finishing up. We're getting close to the end, and there's a couple short simanim left. Some of them are very, very relevant, and some of them are not so relevant. So I think what we're going to do is I'll share with you a kind of a brief overview of some of the ones that are less relevant, and we'll get more in depth to some of the ones that are more relevant. So we are now up to Siman Tes Vav. Siman Tes Vav, the Shulchan Aruch discusses moving tzitzis from one garment to another and what happens when the garment rips. So there are a lot of details that go into this, but I'll just share with you what's relevant. Point number one is you are allowed to remove the strings from one garment and put it onto a new garment. So that would be done by untying all the knots and then putting it through the hole of a new garment and then retying them. That should only be done, says the Shulchan Aruch, if the second garment is also being used for a mitzvah tzitzis. However, you're not supposed to untie your tzitzis if those strings are not going to be used for another tzitzis. That's point number one. Okay, point number two is you have to do it that way. You have to untie the strings and then retie them on the new garment. But let's say you want to cut a corner, pardon the pun, and you take a pair of scissors and you cut the corner of your garment, and you say to yourself, hey, this will be so much easier. Now I don't have to bother with all those knots. I'll just sew this piece of fabric, this little square piece of fabric with the strings onto my new garment. Job done. Simple as that. Says the Shulchan Aruch, you are not allowed to do that. It's supposed to be, the tzitzis are supposed to be tied onto the corner of the garment. That's the language of the Torah. And in this scenario, you're taking, this is not the corner of the garment. This is the corner of a different garment that you took and you put onto a new garment. So that's not going to work. Okay, let's move on. If you have a big talus, they got split in half. So now what do you have? You've got two smaller garments, both of which have four corners, both of which have two of the four that have tzitzis on them. Writes the Shulchan Aruch, if those two halves are big enough to be within the range of the minimum size for a kosher pair of tzitzis, you are allowed to put strings on the missing two corners, meaning two corners that don't have strings yet, and then you're kosher. You just made one pair of tzitzis, one talus into two. That is kosher. Okay, now the Shulchan Aruch gets into the topic of a tear, and this gets complicated whenever there's a tear near the strings. If there's a tear anywhere near the hole where the strings go through the garment, and you want to sew up that tear, that gets into a whole complicated discussion between Rashi and Rav Amram. Is this one the Rav Amram? Yeah. And therefore, that's a complicated issue, and you should definitely try your best to avoid it. And that's why our talesim, they have those reinforced holes. And if that were to occur, if you get a tear near the strings, then you should be in touch with someone who is well-versed in Hilchos Tzitzis that can help you out with that. But I don't think we should, that's not such a common occurrence, so I don't think we should get into all the nitty-gritty of that particular topic. Okay, the Siman Tes Zayin, the next Siman, is about the minimum size of a talus, which really is not relevant to a talus because a talus is, by definition, bigger than it has to be, but it's really relevant to the tzitzis garments, which are much smaller. And this is something that we learned about when we first started this class. So just to quickly review, bottom line, the Shulchan Aruch says, if it's big enough to cover Rosh Overubo, the head and the majority of the body of a minor who is old enough that he could go out to the marketplace on his own. So obviously we're not talking about an 8-year-old, we're talking about, significant age, maybe 11, that might be good enough. That is that is big enough. The Ramah adds that additionally has to be big enough that that even an adult would be willing to, go out to the street wearing such a thing, even a little bit. In terms of on a more practical end, the Mishnah Berurah gives us some numbers, and he says that the ideal size is to have an amma by amma square in the front and an amma by amma square in the back. And then the Mishnah Berurah adds, if it's 3/4 of an amma in length, in front and in back, that is b'diavad good enough as well. Okay, let's move on to Siman Yud Zayin. So this is an interesting one here. The Shulchan Aruch here, Siman Yud Zayin 17, who is obligated in the midst of tzitzis? So the Shulchan Aruch writes, Noshim ve'avadim peturim. Women and servants, meaning a Jewish slave, or not, a non-Jewish slave, who because of his status that he is an eved, a servant to a Jew, he takes on a status as a quasi-Jew. They are not obligated in this mitzvah of tzitzis. Why? Shehi mitzvah aseh shazman garma. Because it is a time-bound mitzvah. And we'll get to the details of what that means that it's time-bound in the next siman. Now the Ramah adds, if a woman wants to wrap herself in a talus and wants to make a bracha, she's allowed to do that. Like any other time-bound mitzvah. So now this is a point which is a machlokas between the Mechaber and the Ramah, the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, which therefore means it's a machlokas between Sephardic and Ashkenazic custom. And the Shulchan Aruch is of the position that women are not allowed to make a bracha on a time-bound mitzvah. Once they are exempt from the mitzvah, they cannot recite a bracha. The Ramah, the Ashkenazic position is they are allowed to make a bracha, and the logic being that they may not have an obligation, but if they do it, they're doing a mitzvah. And therefore, they're allowed to recite a bracha when they do that. Now, the Ramah adds something extremely important. Mechzi ki yuhara. However, it is mechzi ki yuhara. It looks haughty, it looks inappropriate for a woman to wear a talus. That's not appropriate. So therefore, that is why, even though, at least amongst Ashkenazim, it is very common that a woman will shake a lulav on Sukkot, but you will not find women wearing tzitzis. Therefore, they should not wear tzitzis since it is not a chovas gavra. So number one, the Ramah says that it's inappropriate. It's mechzi ki yuara. It looks haughty. It looks like she's trying to draw attention to herself, that she's so righteous. But then he adds a second point here, that it's the nature of the mitzvah is different, such that unlike lulav, where the mitzvah of lulav for a man is an obligation to get that lulav and shake it, with tzitzis, there's no obligation to wear tzitzis. The obligation is someone who is wearing a four-corner garment needs to put tzitzis on those corners. So therefore, when it comes to a woman, it's one thing for her to shake a lulav, right? That is something that a person is obligated to go out and do. So then she could go ahead and do that and recite a bracha. But tzitzis, being that even a man doesn't have an obligation to wear tzitzis, it's only if he opts to wear a four-corner garment, then he's got to put tzitzis on it, then that is a different level of mitzvah, and a woman would not be obligated to do that. Or she's never obligated, but it shouldn't be treated the same way as other mitzvahs. Let's keep it at that. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Chaim. Let's hear your question.
Could a woman do that in private if the issue is that it's haughty?
So that's a good question. So, in theory, yes. There is some type of no. It's not. I was going to say, who was it? There was one big Talmud Chacham, not even someone recent, someone of the previous era, whose daughters wore tzitzis. I know that they say it was Rashi. Rashi's daughters wore tzitzis, but trying to remember, there's a Tosfos that discusses this. I think it's a Tosfos in Yavamis, actually. I don't remember offhand. I'd have to look that up. Okay. I'd be happy to try to look that up. I didn't think to look it up in advance. I'd be happy to try to look that up if you want me to pause the recording and do that, Dimitri and Chaim. It's up to you.
If it's not too much trouble.
Definitely not. Okay, so one second. It doesn't seem to be clear that women would be allowed to recite a bracha, but certainly, no, I take that back. The Ramon says in the beginning, the imrotim la'atfo u'levarich halaver is just biyodo. If they want to make a bracha, they could. He just says that that it's mechzikiyura, and therefore it's better not to do it. Yeah. So if it's in the privacy of their own home, and they're not doing it to present themselves in a certain way as, extra righteous or whatever the case may be, then it seems like, there would not necessarily be anything wrong with a woman wearing tzitzis. Okay, let's continue. Okay, here's a really important one. Dimitri, this one's very relevant for you, for Elisha. He's probably already at this point, but you'll have to remember this for Ezra and Yechezkel. A child, once he knows how to wrap himself, that is when the father becomes obligated to get tzitzis for him to train him. So I think we've mentioned this in the past, that there's a mitzvah of chinuch, that even though no one is obligated in any of the mitzvahs of the Torah until the age of bar mitzvah, there's a mitzvah from the Rabbanon, from the rabbis, of chinuch, which literally means training, that we want to train our children to do mitzvahs so that when their bar mitzvah comes, it doesn't take them by surprise. It's already part of the routine. So I think we've discussed in the past, that how do you know when to start each mitzvah for each kid? So when it comes to tzitzis, the Shulchan Aruch says, Katan hayudei l's'atev, once the child is old enough that he knows how to wrap himself, that is when the father is obligated to get him tzitzis to train him. You also see in the language of the Shulchan Aruch, or I should say the Ramah, that this is clearly an obligation of the parents, that the parents are obligated to train the child. Okay, let's continue. The Ramah adds that it's not just enough that he knows how to throw a garment over his head. He has to be mature enough that he knows to put 2 corners in front and 2 corners in back. And he has the ability, the knowledge to hold together all 4 corners when he recites Kriya Shema. So that is the age at which we have an obligation to get some tzitzis for our kids and get them started practicing the mitzvah. Okay? I think that's about it. Okay.
Yeah, that's good to know. I was actually wondering, because Alicia was asking. He's like, "Can I have one?" So that's a really good.
So now one
Uh,
thing, let me just clarify tzitzis versus talis. Right now we're talking about tzitzis, just simply the mitzvah of wearing a
hmm
four-corner garment, like the thing that we wear underneath our shirt. So Alicia, is probably old enough. He's dressing himself by now. He
Yes, he
can,
is.
so then he would be included. Um, Talis, wearing the special talis that we wear specifically for davening, for that, the Ashkenazic custom is that even after bar mitzvah, boys don't start with that until they get married. That's the common custom. Yakis,
Okay, I see.
German Jews, their custom is to start at bar mitzvah. And Sephardic Jews, similar story. They will start right away at bar mitzvah. Excuse me. Okay,
Okay.
let's continue. Okay, let's see if we can squeeze in one more siman. Siman Yud Ches, number 18. And this one we'll get into a little more detail. Zman tzitzis, the time for the mitzvah of tzitzis. So we mentioned in the past about the practical halacha that you can't make the bracha on your tzitzis too early in the morning. Now there's a set time, and during the winter, you've got to be cautious of that, especially here in Cincinnati. Let's get a little more into the background here. So the Shulchan Aruch writes, Laila lavzman tzitzisu. The nighttime is not the time for the mitzvah of tzitzis. The it has been excluded isem osel, from the pasuk that says that you need to see them. The Torah says you'll see them. That is part of the definition of the mitzvah of tzitzis, is that something that you're going to see. So Chazal, the Gemara, derives from that if the Torah is describing it as something that you see, it must be that the mitzvah only applies during the daytime, which is the time when you're able to see because it's light outside. Now, there's a fascinating machlokas between the Rambam and the Rosh. Laha Rambam, according to the Rambam, Kol ma shelo vesh b'layla patur afilu miyuchad liyom. Whatever you're wearing at the nighttime is exempt from tzitzis, even if it is a garment that is meant for daytime wear. Uma shelo vesh b'yom, whatever you wear during the daytime, chayiv afilu miyuchad l'layla. It is obligated in tzitzis, even if it is meant specifically for wearing at night. So the classic example would be pajamas. Let's say a person has a pair of pajamas that have that's a four-cornered garment. According to the Rambam, if you wear your pajamas during the day, you've got to put tzitzis on them. And vice versa. If you want to put on a regular daytime shirt or tunic that happens to have four corners, and it's already after nightfall, according to the Rambam, you would not be doing a mitzvah, and you would not be obligated, and you would not make a bracha because it's nighttime. Now the Shulchan Aruch continues. Sadinim. I'm sorry, I skipped. That's the Rambam. Ula harash, but according to the Rosh, a garment which is dedicated for the night is exempt even if it's worn by day. A garment which is used for wear at night and at day and at night is obligated even if you're wearing it at night. So according to the Rosh, it depends on the garment. So if I'm wearing my pajamas, even during the daytime, the Rosh would say that I'm exempt from the mitzvah of tzitzis because that's a nighttime garment. but and if I'm wearing my regular shirt at night, I would be obligated. So to kind of sum things up, the machlokas Rambam and Rosh is that the Rambam says it all depends on when you wear them, and according to when you're wearing them currently, I should say, and according to the Rosh, it depends on when is the garment intended to be worn. That's the critical factor according to the Rosh. Okay, the Rama says Hagav v'savik brachos lahakel. Okay, in the verachal of elikish lovesh b'yom v'umiyuchad gam keniyom. When it comes to brachos, then we follow the rule that we never make a bracha if we have a suffix, and therefore, if you have a scenario that either the Rambam or the Rosh would say that you are exempt, you do not make a bracha. So that means if you're putting on your tzitzis at nighttime, then the Rambam would say that that's not the time for the mitzvah, and therefore you do not make a bracha, even though the Rosh would say that you do. And if you're putting on your pajamas during the daytime and they happen to have four corners, according to the Rosh, there's no mitzvah because that's a night garment, and therefore you would not make a bracha. Now, the Mishnah Berurah adds something very, very important. This is only regarding the bracha, but regarding the possibility that you're wearing something that is obligated according to the Torah to have tzitzis, that, writes the Mishnah Berurah, that you haven't escaped. So even though you can't make a bracha, but you better put tzitzis on that garment, or else you are in a possible violation of a Torah obligation. So there you go. Okay. The Rama adds v'achar tfilas arvis after you've davened mariv, afal b'shadayin yom hu ein lavar halav. Even though it might still be daytime, you should not make a bracha. And when Yom Kippur is starting, it's atev b'od yom v'var halav. You should wrap while it's still daytime and then make a bracha. Okay. Okay, let's try to wrap up this siman here, Sif Beis. Sadinim, blankets. Afal pisha adam yashin bahem baboker. Even though a person is still sleeping in them in the morning, ein matil bahem tzitzis. You do not put tzitzis on your blankets. Now, why not? What do you think?
It's a nighttime garment.
Nighttime garment, beautiful. I have a question, though, Chaim. What about the Rambam? That's true according to the Rosh, that it all depends on the garment. But according to the Rambam, doesn't matter. The garment doesn't matter. What matters is when am I wearing it. So if I'm still in bed by the time we get to the morning, which is very common because bear in mind that when we say the morning, we mean as soon as there's a little bit of light. So we're talking about like in the 6s. According to the Rambam, you should have to put tzitzis on your blankets.
Maybe it's just not so nice for the mitzvah because people aren't dressed all the way. But that doesn't take you out of the obligation, though, I guess.
Okay, beautiful. Chaim, beautiful. Okay, so you're saying point number one, that maybe that's an inappropriate place to be doing this mitzvah because a person is typically not fully dressed. And then number two is, but then you pointed out that might be a good reason to explain why, that doesn't take away the obligation. If it's an obligation, then you should have to put the tzitzis there. Okay, so the Mishnah Berurah says, you know what the answer is? Because it's not really a garment. A blanket is not something that you wear. A blanket is something that you just kind of put over you. That's not included in the mitzvah of the Torah at all. The mitzvah of the Torah is only something that is worn or something that you wrap yourself in and not something that you just spread over yourself when you're sleeping at night.
Didn't the Mishnah Berurah also say something about draping it over you when you sleep?
What do you mean?
We said in order to not create a hafsek when sleeping for a long time, like a nap, Mishnah Berurah suggested draping your tzitzis over yourself instead of sleeping with them on if it's not comfortable.
Yes. Very good. Very good. Very good. So I think the answer to your question, you're correct. I think the answer to your question is that here, the way the Mishnah Berurah writes it is, it has to do with the nature of the garment. That a blanket is dedicated for you're never wearing a garment. You're just covering yourself with it. We're just finishing up hands on Halacha Malachi.
Okay.
Welcome. You're just covering, it's dedicated only for covering yourself with it. And that is why why it's not included in the mitzvah.
Mm.
He says an amazing thing, a shocking thing, and we'll end with this. The Mishnah Berurah says, the Mogen Avram writes, you should cut one of the corners off your blanket so you don't have four corners. Right? That's wild. But he ends off, you only have to do that, even according to Mogen Avram, if it's a wool blanket. Because we mentioned before, wool has the greatest degree of obligation in the midst of tzitzit, that it has a biblical obligation according to all opinions, that this extra level of scrutiny applies, but any other blanket that would not apply. So I don't know about you, I don't have any woolen blankets, so I'm pretty safe. But they're not the most comfortable, they're a little itchy. But that is that Chumrah of the Mogen Avram is an interesting one to be aware of. Okay, we're gonna have to hold it here. Yeshakaya Chaim and Dmitry.
Ruchtier,
Have a great night.
you too.
And looks like we'll be finishing off tzitzis next week. Mirza Hashem.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.